The Queen's Decision, Marriage for Power, Not Love. In the royal courts of history, marriages were not made for love, but for strategic alliances. For centuries, royal families used marriage as a political tool, cementing relationships with other powerful families, forging alliances, and securing the future of their dynasties. However, this tradition also led to the prevalence of inbreeding, especially in families that feared losing power and influence to outside forces. In one such case, a queen determined to maintain her family's power made the fateful decision to marry within her own bloodline. The queen in question was raised with a strong sense of duty to her family's legacy. Her royal bloodline, although noble and powerful, was small, and there were few eligible suitors that could preserve the strength of her family's lineage. Faced with the prospect of marrying outside her bloodline, which could potentially weaken her family's claim to the throne, the queen and her advisors decided that the best option was to marry a close relative. This marriage, while politically advantageous, was fraught with dangers. At the time, the harmful effects of inbreeding were not fully understood, and many royal families believed that maintaining their bloodline within the family would ensure purity, power, and continuity. What they failed to recognize, however, was the genetic risk involved. In this case, the queen's decision to marry her close relative, possibly her cousin or even an uncle, was one that would soon have catastrophic consequences. The queen's wedding was a grand affair marked by the splendor and extravagance expected of royal unions. However, beneath the surface of opulence lay the dark reality of the queen's decision. Her marriage was not driven by affection, but by the need to preserve her family's dynastic power, and this desire to keep power within the family would lead to one of the most tragic episodes in royal history. After the marriage, the queen and her husband began producing heirs, hoping to secure the family's legacy for future generations. It was only after the birth of their first child that the true consequences of inbreeding began to surface. The child, though initially appearing healthy, soon began showing signs of physical and mental deformities that were unlike anything the royal family had ever witnessed before. The birth of this child marked the beginning of a tragic chapter in the queen's reign. Her decision to marry a close relative, once seen as a way to preserve the family's bloodline, was now viewed as a catastrophic mistake. What was meant to strengthen the family's power instead gave rise to a legacy of genetic disorders, deformities, and suffering that would plague the royal family for generations to come. Was the queen's decision to marry within her family driven solely by political motives, or did personal ambition and a desire for control play a larger role in her choice? What do you think? Could the queen have made a different choice for the sake of her family's future, or was her decision inevitable given the pressures of royal life? Share your thoughts in the comments. The birth of a tragic heir. A child marked by royal inbreeding. The birth of the queen's child should have been a moment of celebration and joy, as it meant the continuation of the royal bloodline and the promise of a prosperous future for the kingdom. However, the reality was far from joyous. From the moment the child was born, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The infant's appearance was alarming, with noticeable physical deformities, and as the child grew older, it became increasingly apparent that the mental and physical issues were not just superficial, but deep-rooted and unmanageable. Doctors and court advisors who had initially been optimistic about the child's health began to raise concerns as the infant aged. Physical deformities such as malformed limbs and a distinct facial appearance that seemed unusual for a royal heir were just the beginning. As the child grew older, mental faculties were also noticeably impaired. The child showed signs of developmental delays, cognitive challenges, and behavioral problems that could not be ignored. The royal family, deeply invested in the future of their lineage, faced a dilemma. The child, once considered the future ruler and successor, was now a symbol of a dark and painful truth. The queen, who had given birth to this heir, began to experience guilt, as well as a growing sense of despair. She had hoped to strengthen the royal family through her marriage, but instead, she had birthed a child whose health issues cast a shadow over her reign. At court, whispers began to circulate. Some believed that the child's condition was a result of divine punishment for the queen's inbreeding, a tragic consequence of her desire to preserve royal blood. Others, more sympathetic, saw the child's suffering as a reflection of the cruel nature of royal politics, where marriage was not about love, but survival and power. Yet despite the sympathy, the queen faced intense pressure. The royal court, the nobles, and even her own family were all questioning her decisions and wondering what this meant for the future of the dynasty. The queen, desperate to protect her son and the future of the dynasty, took measures to shield him from public view. He was kept hidden away in the royal palace, away from the prying eyes of the public, while the queen began to search for any possible solutions to his condition. She consulted the best physicians, astrologers, and healers, hoping for a miracle, but no one could offer an answer. The royal family, once proud and invincible, was now faced with the heartbreaking reality that the next generation of rulers might be lost to genetic defects. As the child aged, the situation became more complicated. His behavior became more erratic, and his physical health continued to decline. The once promising heir was now a shadow of what he could have been, and the queen's regret over her decision to marry her close relative began to fester. She could not undo the past, but she could not help but wonder if she had brought this fate upon her family. The weight of her decision was unbearable, and her reign, once full of promise, now carried with it the haunting knowledge that the child she had hoped would inherit the throne might never be fit to rule. Despite the tragic circumstances surrounding the birth of the child, the royal family tried to maintain appearances. They continued to present the child to the court on rare occasions, though it was evident to all who saw him that he was not the healthy and vibrant heir they had hoped for. His presence at court was both a symbol of the family's pride and an acknowledgement of their devastating failure. The public, while sympathetic, could not ignore the fact that the royal family's future had been irrevocably altered. Was the child's condition truly a result of the queen's decision to marry within her family? Or could there have been other factors that contributed to his health problems? And if the child's fate was sealed by inbreeding, could the queen have foreseen the consequences of her actions? What do you think? Could the queen have made a different choice for the sake of her child's health, or was the outcome of her marriage inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments. The king's madness, a ruler who could not escape his bloodline. As the child grew older, his mental and physical health continued to decline. What had once been a kingdom full of hope and prosperity was now beset with the painful truth. The heir to the throne, the future ruler of the realm, was severely compromised. The queen, though initially filled with maternal love and hope, was increasingly overcome by guilt. But it was not just her own suffering that weighed heavily on her. The nation, too, felt the tremors of uncertainty that came with the knowledge of the compromised heir. The young prince, now a teenager, exhibited disturbing behavior that further deepened the tragedy. His cognitive delays grew more pronounced, and his erratic actions became more difficult to ignore. The court began to notice his violent outbursts and disjointed speech. What had started as an attempt to protect the royal bloodline through marriage had now led to a scenario where the king's heir seemed utterly unfit to lead, let alone survive in a world that demanded sharp intellect and emotional stability. The king, once a strong and revered ruler, could no longer stand the sight of his son's suffering. His despair turned into a deep-seated rage, and he began to retreat from his royal duties, consumed by frustration. He believed his lineage and his reign had been cursed by his own actions and the actions of his wife. His once clear mind became clouded with thoughts of failure and betrayal. He had long since realized that the boy he had hoped would one day take over his throne was not capable of ruling. The king's increasing obsession with his son's condition and his inability to address the future of the kingdom plunged him into madness. What started as a deep sense of guilt and helplessness turned into paranoia. The king believed that his son's deformities were a punishment from the gods, a direct consequence of the inbreeding that had tainted his royal bloodline. He became convinced that his kingdom's downfall was imminent and that he was to blame for the curse upon his family. His paranoia began to affect his decision-making. He alienated his closest advisors and family members, whom he suspected of harboring their own ambitions to take the throne. In a desperate attempt to change his fate, he ordered the boy to be secluded in the royal palace, hidden away from the public eye, believing that this was the only way to prevent further damage to the royal reputation. But even that was not enough to quell the king's fears. The madness that consumed the king had ripple effects on the entire kingdom. His reign, once prosperous, had now turned to chaos. The empire that had once been a beacon of power and wealth now seemed weak and divided. The nobility began to question the king's sanity and his ability to rule, leading to a gradual erosion of the monarchy's power. Political factions rose up, eager to seize control as the king's grip on the throne weakened. It wasn't long before the king's own advisors and generals, fearing the collapse of the kingdom, began to plot against him. The court, which had once been filled with sycophants and those eager to please the king, now became a nest of intrigue and betrayal. The very people who had once pledged loyalty to the throne now saw the king as a liability, a ruler whose madness threatened to destroy everything. In the end, it was not just the king's obsession with his son's condition that led to his downfall, but his inability to govern effectively under the pressure of his personal crisis. The kingdom, once a proud and powerful nation, had now been reduced to a fragile state, and its future hung in the balance. The child, forever marked by the curse of his bloodline, could never rise to rule, and the king, who had once been the embodiment of strength, had fallen victim to his own mind. Was the king's madness a result of the hereditary flaws caused by inbreeding, or was it the immense pressure of ruling, compounded by guilt and fear, that drove him to insanity? What do you think? Was the king's madness inevitable given the circumstances, or could he have overcome the guilt and found a way to heal the royal bloodline? Share your thoughts in the comments. The end of the dynasty, a legacy forever marked by tragedy. As the king's reign came to a devastating end, the empire he had once ruled with pride and strength began to unravel. His descent into madness, combined with the crippling effects of the bloodline he had hoped to preserve, led to a swift and chaotic collapse. The young prince, the product of the royal inbreeding, had become a tragic figure, locked away from the world, and his condition would forever tarnish the royal lineage. The kingdom that had once stood as a powerful force now lay in ruins, its future uncertain. The political intrigue that had been brewing within the court finally reached its peak. The king's increasingly erratic decisions had alienated his advisors, and many of his former supporters now saw an opportunity to seize power. The nobles who had once sworn loyalty to the crown now turned against the king. As whispers of rebellion spread through the kingdom, those who were closest to the king began plotting his removal. It became clear that the monarchy, which had ruled for centuries, was at its breaking point. In his final days, the king was isolated, surrounded by those who once served him, but who now viewed him as a liability. His mental state had deteriorated so severely that he could no longer distinguish between reality and the delusions that plagued his mind. The pain of his son's condition, combined with the guilt of his own decisions, had driven him to the brink of insanity. The king, once a figure of strength and authority, had become a shadow of his former self, consumed by his failures and the legacy of his bloodline. The end came swiftly. The king was deposed by his own court, a coup led by those who had once been his trusted advisors and generals. His final moments were marked not by the grandeur of a royal death, but by the quiet humiliation of being betrayed by those he had once ruled. The kingdom, now leaderless and in disarray, plunged into chaos. The young prince, unable to take the throne due to his mental and physical impairments, was quietly exiled, hidden away from the public eye, and left to live out his life in isolation. The once proud dynasty that had ruled for generations was now gone, its legacy forever marked by tragedy and failure. The royal bloodline, which had been carefully guarded and protected for centuries, had finally come to an end. The kingdom that had been the envy of the world was now a shadow of its former self, its power diminished by the consequences of inbreeding and the destruction it had caused within the royal family. The prince, who had been meant to carry the crown, was forgotten, and his name faded into history as a cautionary tale. In the years that followed, the empire was divided and fragmented, with various factions vying for control. The once centralized power of the monarchy was replaced by a fractured system of rulers, each trying to claim their share of the kingdom. The tragedy of the royal family became a symbol of the dangers of inbreeding and the destructive power of unchecked ambition. The downfall of the king, his son, and the dynasty was a reminder that even the most powerful families could be undone by the weight of their own bloodlines. Was the fall of the royal family inevitable due to the genetic consequences of inbreeding, or could the dynasty have been saved had different choices been made? What do you think? Could the royal family have avoided its tragic end, or was their fate sealed from the beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments. The story of the queen who gave birth to a child marked by the consequences of royal inbreeding is a tragic reminder of the dangers of preserving bloodlines at all costs. The choices made by the royal family, driven by a desire for power and control, ultimately led to the downfall of a once great dynasty. The king's descent into madness and the suffering of his son highlight the dark side of royal politics, where the pursuit of power can lead to irreparable damage. While the royal family may have been destroyed, their story serves as an important lesson for future generations. It is a reminder that the consequences of inbreeding and the manipulation of family ties for political gain can have devastating effects, not only on individuals but on entire kingdoms. The tragedy of this royal family reminds us that the pursuit of power, unchecked by reason or empathy, can lead to the destruction of even the most powerful of empires.